Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One on One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. In the final episode of this series, we want to speak about our current reality, or perhaps the reality of the recent past. Corona, or COVID, depending on where you live in the world, has brought suffering for so many of us, whether in actual deaths, illness, long COVID symptoms. For some, it was their first meeting with the utter unpredictability of life. And for others, it was a new challenge within an old frame that they were already familiar with. We wanted to speak about COVID through the prism of universal suffering. It bridges us between the Holocaust, which was universal suffering caused by man, to each other, to other kinds of suffering like natural disasters and plagues. Are they categorically different from other kinds of suffering? And can we, or dare we, make meaning out of them? You know, Tanya, in the beginning of this whole Corona period, I remember thinking that it was the first time in the 13 years I had lived in this country that I was actually experiencing something even minorly similar as my family was across the world. I have one sibling who's a 16-hour plane ride away, and other family members that are 10 hours away. And I remember thinking that it was such a weird moment, in a very also awkward way, somewhat comforting, that we were all experiencing something similar. But at that same moment that I was aware that we were experiencing something similar, also it was very clear to me that we were each experiencing it in a unique way. And I think we'll circle back to this point when we talk in general about suffering, that even though it's a universal idea, everybody experiences it very, very differently. And so it contributes to its sense that it's a very lonely experience. And so how I experienced it here with, my 4 children and having just literally given birth to a baby was obviously going to be very different than how my mother experienced it in her life.
Right, Yosef, I think that idea of suffering being, a perennial human circumstance, but at the same time that everyone suffers in a slightly different way, and therefore it creates that sense of loneliness, is something that all of us felt during COVID. I remember saying at the beginning how for the first time, maybe certainly since I've known, every single human being across the globe had experienced something similar in terms of some kind of adversity related to COVID. And yet all of us were experiencing it slightly differently. And I think in a sense, it really relates to everything we've been speaking about over the last 3 episodes. I wanted to actually connect the last episodes with this current episode by opening with some ideas from Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Dr. Yitz Greenberg, Professor Yitz Greenberg. He is, just a bit of a background for those that don't know. Rav Yitz Greenberg is a American theologian, American rabbi. He was the rabbi of Riverdale community for many, many years, but he's also a very well-known American intellectual. He's known as one of the main post-Holocaust philosophers who dealt in the 1970s and 1980s with Holocaust philosophy. And he's also a very, very well-known and loved teacher and activist. He was one of the founders and creators of the Washington Holocaust Memorial Museum and a whole variety of various educational institutions in America. I really felt that we didn't speak about him last week, Yosefa, when we spoke about post-Holocaust theologians. But I think the reason that I wanted to bring him this week is that there's a deep connection between the last episode where we dealt with the Holocaust and this episode where we're kind of trying, or at least offering, some responses to our current COVID situation. So just to give a very, very brief summary of what he says. So Rav Yitz came from the Orthodox world. He was a teacher in Yeshiva University for many years. He was definitely a controversial figure at the time. Left of orthodoxy, if we're going to look at it from a spectrum perspective. And his response was definitely considered controversial, perhaps even radical, actually, at the time. In the 5 decades since he wrote, he's definitely revised elements of it, and his upcoming magnum opus, which will come out, hopefully, I pray very soon, called The Triumph of Life, revises some of the ideas that he first came out with immediately after the Holocaust, or certainly 2 decades after the Holocaust. But I want to just touch on one of these ideas, and that's the idea of the voluntary covenant. Rav Yitz, using Elie Wiesel and another thinker, Gladstein, he talks about this idea that he asked the question, right? How, if we have a covenantal relationship with God, how can the Holocaust, which seems to essentially be a suicide mission, God sent us on this suicide mission, right? How can we be expected to fulfill, the commandments that God gave us? We can't be expected to go on this kind of suicide mission to just put our lives on the line for this covenantal relationship, for upholding the covenantal relationship. For him, in a way, and very, very importantly, the Holocaust is a seminal event. It's an event that shatters. It's a shattering, right? If we remember last time, Yosefa, we were looking at Berkowitz, and we were looking at Fackenheim, and we were looking at a few other philosophers. For some of them, the event was shattering, and for some of them, it wasn't. It was kind of a continuation where we took the same paradigms and just applied them to the Holocaust. For Greenberg, it's shattering. It's a shattering event. Which
we also said was interesting, considering the fact that he himself didn't experience it, meaning he was a second generation and he was reflecting on it afterward. And we also had mentioned that for those who went through the Holocaust, there was a certain functionality and pushing through that was necessary, and that Elie Wiesel, right, was one of the first who sort of, as a survivor, broke that kind of silence.
Exactly.
But that he, reflecting in the Yad Vashem already in Israel, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, was coming at it from a different generation. And also for him, it was dafka a shattering, even though he wasn't the one who experienced it firsthand.
So he definitely goes through an existential crisis. Almost in every account that he speaks about the Holocaust, he speaks about the year 1961 as that transformative moment where he leaves America. And that I think is super important. He kind of leaves that progressive, pragmatic kind of environment, and he goes to Israel, where even though he had family that had gone through the Holocaust, his parents very, very rarely spoke about it. And he comes to America in 1961, and he's interestingly invited to the Eichmann trials, and he resists. He says, no, you know what, I'll listen to it on the radio. And when he goes to Yad Vashem for the first time, he is exposed to things he never knew before about the Holocaust, and he talks about it being absolutely shattering. He speaks about the fact that he was putting on his tefillin in the morning and he couldn't bring himself to say the words of the tefillah because it was such a theologically shattering moment to be exposed to everything that had happened in the Holocaust. And when he returns the year after to America, it takes him almost 2 decades to actually express that shattering in theological terminology. But when he does, he speaks about it in terms of God breaking his covenant with the people of Israel. And that's very radical. Now, he since then has revised it, but I just want to, for a second, I want to leave the revision for a minute, and I want to look at what he speaks about, because I think it's really important for us to understand. He speaks about this idea that God, a covenantal relationship means that God is meant to protect us. And in the Holocaust, he doesn't protect us. And therefore, to a degree, he's broken that covenantal relationship. However, and here he kind of draws on Fackenheim. And by the way, the relationship between Fackenheim and Greenberg, they had a friendship. And Fackenheim actually attributes some of his theological thinking to Greenberg. Most people think it's the other way around, but it isn't, which is really, really fascinating. One of his books he dedicates to Greenberg's thinking. But Fackenheim also, if you remember, he looks at the people and he says, well, hold on a minute. Look how they're continuing the covenant, even though they don't need to. Greenberg says something similar. He talks about this period. He looks at it from a more religious perspective than Fackenheim, but he speaks about the idea that in this period after the Holocaust, the people have continued to step up and uphold their covenantal duties. And what he talks about is this is the period of what he calls the voluntary covenant. that the people are this time, they're not coerced, they're not feeling that they have to, but they're voluntarily taking up the covenant.
Which is significant also, Tanya, because he speaks about the covenant having 3 stages, right?
Exactly.
That the first stage is the biblical period where God is almost domineering, right? And extremely present and intervenes in very overt ways. And then he speaks about this part, I really actually, by the way, found extremely meaningful, where he speaks about the rabbinic period.
Yeah.
That the covenant had to be completely revised.
Yeah.
When we were living in a period without the temple, and we were living in a period where we had to re-envision our self-limits, living in an exiled existence, and that's a period where you obviously have, and he brings a number of passages from the Talmud where we want to bring God in an almost intervening way, but lo b'shamayim, right? The Torah is meant to be here, and we almost in the small ways that God can be overtly present in the biblical way, he almost gets pushed out of the picture.
Exactly.
And the rabbis maintain their sovereignty, they maintain their role, their leadership role, and then he moves on to the 3rd stage, which he says in modernity, we got close in the beginning with the Enlightenment, where again, God's role was being re-envisioned in our lives.
Yeah, but I just want to stop you a second, because in the 3rd stage, it's not so simple. When he talks about, let me just backtrack one sec, because I just want to talk about the rabbinic era. It's so fascinating because we think, oh, the rabbis were authoritative, but Dafka, what Greenberg shows us is that the rabbinic period was massively innovative. They took this idea of tzimtzum, of God contracting himself from this kind of mystical framing, and they apply it to the idea on a very practical way of basically God slowly disappearing, but still being present. In a sense, what the rabbis do is they say and this is how Greenberg frames it, the covenantal role has gone through some kind of organic and dynamic change, whereby in the biblical period, God was the main authoritative figure and we were kind of more passive. In the rabbinic era, the rabbis frame it in a sense that we have become almost on par as a covenantal partner with God, and we've taken up a far greater role in the covenant. God has contracted himself in order, and this is the key. This is what he wants us to understand. This is how it's meant to be. It's ideal. The ideal way is that we as human beings take on a greater role in the covenant during the rabbinic period. And then, as Yosefa, you said, there's the 3rd period. And he originally argues that the trigger for the 3rd period is the Holocaust. And the Holocaust shows us that we as human beings have to take on an even greater role. As time goes on, he recognizes that this actually began, exactly as you said, with the onset of enlightenment, emancipation, and modernity, where humanity is given the tools to grow up, in a sense, even more, and become what he calls the managing partner in the covenant. That our greatest dignity as human beings, is to be B'Tselem Elokim, and the greatest part of that is to be free, is to have autonomy over ourselves. And that is what the modern period gave us. And in a sense, what happens then is God contracts himself even further, right? And we become an even greater partner, whereby we become what he calls the senior partners in the covenant.
I think I really love that metaphor, by the way. Imagining a law firm, right? A law firm where you first have someone who is, working a million hours in the beginning, and the people over them are very dominant in their lives. And obviously, as you go up in the totem pole, your level of responsibility becomes greater, and your also ability to make independent decisions becomes greater, right? You learn to intuit. It's not getting rid of God. It's that the more that God becomes part of who we are as humans, that we are able to intuit godly decisions.
Exactly. So I would actually use a different paradigm, which Greenberg uses very often, and that's the idea of a parent and a child, that when a child is younger, and we've spoken about this in the past.
Yeah, we spoke about this in the last episode. Yeah.
Yeah. In the last episode, when the child is younger, the parent has to be present. But actually, the child hasn't, as you said, intuited all the parent's values, etc., etc. As the child grows up, the parent is not next to the child in a physical sense, but is living within that child. And I think that's really what Greenberg's saying here, is that God is actually more present now, even than he was in the biblical period. It's just that the presence, his presence now is different to his presence.
It's inside of us.
Right.
It's inside of us. It's not external to us. It's inside of us. And
exactly.
And right. So that leaves God in the picture, even though God is essentially becoming more muted in the broader picture. It refashions.
Totally. And it's very easy for people to say, oh, well, God doesn't exist, which is exactly what happens. You see Nietzsche, right? The death of God, and all the philosophers, Kant, etc., etc. We don't need any kind of authoritative metaphysical being to give us law and morality. It can all come from within. And Dafka, that's exactly what Greenberg says. Yes, it can come from within, but we have to sense God's presence even when he isn't manifest in the same way he was in the biblical period. Yosefa, I wanted to just read a very, very short quote from Greenberg. For those of you, by the way, who are interested in his thought, there's many articles on his website.
We're going to link them in the episode notes, so they'll be there.
So let me just read a very short quote. He says like this: God is no longer dictating from heaven through the prophets, but speaks to us through human analysis and multiple interpretations. Wherever we are, sharing our pain and our joy, God gives humans greater authority and responsibility to carry out the covenant, right? So in a sense, what he's saying is in the third stage.
Well, that's in the second stage he's speaking about that.
That was the second stage, right? He describes that as the rabbinic stage, but I would say even more so in the third stage, right? Because in the rabbinic stage we have, right? The Talmud is all about multiple interpretations and the authority to carry out the covenant, as you said, lo b'shamayim he, right? In the story of Tanosh Alachnai, there's so many examples in the Talmud where we're basically saying the authority now lies with the rabbis. But the third stage, and this is where Rav Yitz gets slightly radical, because he calls the third stage the lay period or the lay leadership. And what he says is that in the third stage, it's no longer the rabbis who have the authority to tell us what to do or to direct and channel us, but the authority lies with the lay person, with every person in their own home, every person in their own mind, in their own heart. And in that period, we're given total, full responsibility for tikkun olam, right? God stays close. He's with us. He's sustaining us. But there's no magical intervention. What's happening is that God is operating through human agency. And the agency of humanity no longer is with God, like in the biblical stage, and it's no longer with the rabbis, like in the rabbinic stage. It's with each and every one of us. And, Yosefa, there's no question that this is a slightly controversial idea.
Yeah, it's very obvious how this can go into directions that are halachically borderline. Yeah. I understand.
And even more so when he speaks about, which I don't want to get into here, but he speaks about the idea of holy secularity, where the secular and religious divide is smaller than it ever was before. And he talks about the idea that even totally non-religious people are doing secular work in building the state of Israel in high tech and all the various other things. And he really looks at it through the prism of tikkun, of, tikkun olam, of healing the world, etc. But I do want to say one thing that I find very profound, is that if you look at it empirically, there's some things that really ring true. If we look at how much in the past, and I was talking more about the Dati Leumi world, kind of the modern Orthodox, world, where in the past we would far more look to rabbinic authority. If we had a question or any kind of question, we would straight away go and ask our rabbi. And if we look at how many people now, just people who are very learned, women who are becoming yotzei halacha, or even women who are just learning far more, are taking halachic authority into their own hands. They're no longer calling up their rabbi. They're going to the books, they're researching it, and they're finding the halachic answers themselves. And I think that there is a kind of movement from that ladder of rabbinic authority down to lay leadership, and not even lay leadership, just the lay person. And I think that's super interesting. Like, the more I think about it, the more I muse on Rav Yitz's ideas. And I have to say that I should have said before that my doctorate is on Rav Yitz's thoughts. So I have been really musing over it for the last 4.5 years.
I think that we could, spend many episodes speaking about the democratization of halakha, but I think we'll leave that on the side for now. But I think that that's a very important point. But I want to bring Rav Yitz back to the pandemic. Okay, I want us to circle back to our topic for today, he did speak out. I would say I felt that throughout the pandemic, there weren't that many rabbinic voices that I felt were really out there that I was hearing in my little four amot. But he was speaking out during the pandemic. And I want us to see one idea that he brings and to bring us back to this idea.
Yeah. So 100% he was speaking out. I just wanted to kind of define what you're saying. There were a lot of rabbinic halachic responses to the pandemic where people would come out and say, you should get the vaccine, you shouldn't, or you should stay at home and not go. But there were very few theological responses to the pandemic.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And I think that, by the way, just Yosefa, in terms of what we've been looking at, that we said in the earlier period, there was a lot of reward and punishment and this prism of cause and effect. We've moved away from that.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that the fact that there has been so little, and again, here I'm very much speaking about the more Datilo and me world, not the more Haredi world, but there's been very little theological responses, actually an attestament to the fact that we have moved past that kind of reward, punishment, cause, effect, theological framing to something more peripheral, which is exactly what we've been speaking about, whereby
something more personal, meaning that no leader really wanted to go out there and impose general meaning, which is exactly what we've been saying this entire time, right? That everybody has to sort of come to it on their own. On the other hand, there were many people, I know people who spoke to me about it, they felt very bereft, like I want someone to hold my hand and help me. And I just kept thinking to myself that I think they're probably just as lost as we all are. And I think everyone, looks at authority differently depending on how close or far you are from authority. But I just kept thinking, no one knows what to say right now. We're in the middle. No one has enough perspective. It's not like, people who lived 80 years, they had a perspective on this from 70 years ago. No one had perspective on it. So I just sort of felt like, I don't know, everybody was somewhat confused. But okay, why don't you bring us to Rabbi Greenberg?
Yeah, I'm going to bring you. I just want to say one thing in terms of, you said that they wanted someone to hold their hands. I think that's exactly the point, that in the third era, as Greenberg would say, no one is there to hold our hand. In a sense, we have to take that into our own hands. And I think that's exactly what's been going on. And we've seen it having played out exactly as it's played out. But anyway, so this is one thing he says. He wrote a few different articles. And he says as follows: the proper human response is to appreciate the greatness of creation and embrace and take part in the cosmic realm, while turning to God's presence and closeness to sustain meaning and life in the face of tragedy and plague. In a sense, what he speaks about here is the idea that that there's different models of religious understanding, but the version of causal sin or sin and punishment or reward and punishment, just with the virus, it just doesn't work. It doesn't sit comfortably. It just doesn't work in this period. And we're mistaken if we're able to, or if we do that. And instead, what we really need to be doing, and this is what he kept honing in, is that the vital religious response, right, is to uphold the covenantal process, as he calls it, right? And create world repair and kind of deal with the pandemic through scientific research, through doctors, through prioritizing research for cures, all of these things. That's the fulfillment of our covenantal role today. Epidemiology, all the various things that have been going on.
It reminds me, Tanya, I was speaking to a friend, Shuli Mishkin, who I had on the podcast earlier in an earlier season. And she had said to me that her current favorite tefillah at that point, we met right after people got their first vaccine. And she said that her favorite tefillah at that point was, she was having extra kavanah and atachonen ladam da'at, that God gives wisdom and knowledge to humans. So she said that this is a time where my tefillah hasn't been God save me and, save us all from the burning building, but has please give wisdom to all these physicians and researchers who are trying to, find a vaccine and try and alleviate the suffering of the world. And I think that that's exactly what Rabbi Greenberg would would say here, right? We need to create that. That's the partnership. The partnership is to turn to God for closeness and for meaning, and understand that we have to put ourselves in between that, meaning humans have to partner with God in order to create that. So essentially, again, we've brought you just sort of some sound bites of Rabbi Greenberg's thought, both his post-Holocaust theology and from the number of articles he wrote in the past 2 years. But he sort of really reinforces an idea that we've been seeing up until now, of this idea of that we also saw within Chazal, of moving away from the why question. It's not a helpful way to think. Rabbi Greenberg would say it's covenantally inappropriate. It's a covenantally inappropriate question to ask at this point in history, which I think takes it like a step further. It's not just, Tanya and Yosefa having conversation and trying to, mine our different theologies, but he was saying it's not the right question to ask anymore. And, but really we want the what question. What do we do from here? How do we move forward? What meaning do we make it from it?
Right. So 100%. I think what he would say is that it's just not congenial to the third era. It's not an appropriate question to ask anymore.
And we felt how inappropriate it was when you talk about a plague. Meaning it's one thing to say somebody got cancer, somebody died in a car accident, which are like these individual events where people always kind of wonder in their mind, right? Like if they're the observer or the child or whoever it is, was there something that caused that? Was there a theological basis for it if they think like that? But when it comes to the world suffering and people literally just falling in the streets from a virus, it's just you feel the absurdity of the question at a mass scale in a way that I think at an individual scale we might feel less sometimes, but certainly when it's at such mass scale of suffering, people don't think that.
Yeah, I don't know if I think Dafka. I think you feel the question. It's like we'll bring at the end Yishai Ribo asking, what should we make from this? Like the question is actually very, very.
No, what we make from it, but now why is it happening?
Right. I think what the absurdity is
that's what I meant. The why. The why question is absurd. Why. Not the meaning question. The meaning question is what we're left with. Right. I agree with you.
Right. Exactly. The why question is almost inappropriate. Right. And I think, it was interesting because immediately after, very, very soon after, in fact, the virus happened, I saw a book by, the French public intellectual Bernard-Henri Levi, and he wrote a book called The Virus in the Age of Madness. And it was published, I'm just looking, 2020, it was published, quite a few months after the pandemic, started. And I remember I ordered it and I started reading it. I had no idea.
But he had started writing it before? Explain this to me. He started writing it?
No,
he wrote it
during
the plague, right?
He wrote it.
The virus.
Yeah, he wrote it during he wrote it, yeah, it's a modern day plague. He wrote it during the virus. I don't know exactly when in 2020 it was published. Okay. I imagine towards the end of 2020. Yeah. I can't remember exactly when I got it, but I saw it and I thought, you know what, let's have a read. And I ordered it and it was really fascinating book. It was called The Virus in the Age of Madness. And in a sense, what he does is he negates the journey or the need, right, to impose generic universal meaning on this virus, on this plague, as you will call it, right? And he essentially answers that it's arbitrary, that the plague is an arbitrary thing, and any meaning that we impose on it is also totally arbitrary. Like, the plague is just the plague. The virus is just a virus. Like, there's nothing, all of this kind of religious meaning or people saying this is what we've done to the environment and this is the ecosystem, etc. He totally and utterly rejects any of those things. And I'm just going to read you a very kind of one thing that he says that I think reflects and echoes the general sentiment of the book. He says like this, he says, I will repeat first that viruses are dumb. They are blind. They are not here to tell us their stories or to relay the stories of humanity's bad shepherds. And consequently, there is no good use, no societal lesson, no last judgment to be expected from a pandemic. Nothing to be drawn from it except simple unemotional observations on the state of a health system, for example, and the fact that we never spend enough anywhere for research teams or hospitals. In a sense, what he says is we can elicit practical or pragmatic lessons, but we cannot elicit theological lessons because a pandemic or a virus is just that. So that's one extreme view, that basically it's totally arbitrary. And then there's another view that came out during the pandemic, and that's the view of radical theism. Do you know what I'm talking about there, Yosefa?
Yeah, well, we spoke a little bit about that also in an earlier episode, I believe.
Right.
Right, which basically says what?
So radical theism would be, and by the way, not specific to Judaism, right?
Yeah, it's a blaming. No, it's a blaming situation.
Right. Many, and we've heard these voices coming out from many different religious extremities. The idea that the plague is a punishment for not being modest enough, and therefore we have to cover our faces now, or speaking badly, and therefore we have to put masks on, or humanity's inability to take responsibility for God's world. Okay, all of those more theological responses that sit in the position of, exactly as you said, right, of blame and shame and sin and punishment. Now, again, even within, and I would say even within not necessarily radical positions, but we've heard even from secular or atheist positions, very much, which is ironic to a degree, very much the blame and the shame. Okay, if we had looked after our ecosystem better, then this would never have happened. If we didn't eat animals, then this would never have happened. Okay, and again, we could, where does a natural cause and effect stop and a theological blaming start? And I think it's a very, very thin line, Yosefa, which is why I think we have to be super careful when we impose generic meaning structures onto a current reality.
Right. But I mean, I don't think that we're and certainly in our conversations, we're not trying to impose generic meaning. We're trying to impose, I would say, individual meaning.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think that things become generic when they become generalized. And we could say that, COVID came here and reminded us that we all maybe think that connection through screens are going to, be almost the same as regular human connection. And then comes Corona and reminds us that really human connection can't be replaced. We can talk about some broader ideas, but I think that whenever we run the general, we run along the lines of something that is generic, and sometimes that could be sort of trite for many people.
Totally. And I think, again, what you just said in terms of the human connection, et cetera, what I think is that when we're speaking about it from a personal perspective, when we're imposing meaning for ourselves, when we're saying, my suffering or my experience of the pandemic has led me to realize that XYZ for myself, is very different than saying that God brought down this pandemic in order for us to XYZ. Now, again, in a sense, it sounds like hermeneutic quibble, what we're talking about. But actually, I think there's a very deep difference between those two things. And I think this is exactly what we've been talking about throughout the last 4 episodes. When it comes to suffering, there's a very big difference of someone coming and applying a generic meaning for everybody or for you and your suffering and saying it's because God is doing this and that, as opposed to someone bringing meaning for themselves. And we're going to talk about this as we go on today. I wanted to just bring in perhaps like a third perspective, and that comes from, again, very applicable, written almost 50, 60 years ago. It was written straight after the Second World War. Camus' The Plague. And there he talks, again, it's about a story about a plague that hits a city. And in the plague, we see it from the perspective of the doctor who's trying to, ease the suffering and help people through it. And there's various different guises of the way people respond to the plague. And one of them is the pastor who comes after the death of a child, and he tries to explain it through God's punishment or God trying to impose meaning, etc., etc. And the main character, who's the Dr. Ria, he's angered by the pastor's classic theodicy, classic of explaining or justifying, the death of a child or suffering and a plague in that way. And he responds and he says the only way to fight a plague or fight the plague is with decency. And he says the only job we all have is to heal and to be active and to find ways to ease the suffering of another person. And if you remember, one of the litmus tests we started at right at the beginning when we talked about how do we speak about suffering, how do we speak about evil, how do we speak about personal adversity, we said that perhaps one of the litmus tests when we're talking to somebody else who's suffering is to ask, does my response ease their suffering? Or does it make it worse? And I think when I read the Camus, The Plague, which again I read also very soon after the pandemic started, what I realized is that what the doctor, the main character, is trying to do is to say to us, or to say to all the other characters in the book, right? Rather than looking for answers, rather than trying to impose meaning at that moment of great, great suffering, let's just try in the best human way possible that we have to ease the suffering of the other. That is the only job that we have as human beings today. And this works very well also with what Greenberg is saying in terms of the third era. In the third era, nothing is clear. It's not like the biblical era where God came down, told us all through himself, all through prophets, why we're suffering. There was cause, there was effect. There was even the paradigm of sin and punishment, because that's what we needed at the time as human beings.
Yeah, no, I think that a big difference between those obviously is where God places in them.
Yeah.
I think that we're sort of circling around the same point, but I don't think that Camus' philosophical response, which is being guised through a novel, is placing God there, meaning it's about human decency. It's not about the theological space that we occupy as observant Jews. So I think that that's a response that can be incorporated into a theological perspective that I think many of us observant Jews are trying to inhabit in our life.
100%. Let's not forget that Camus was an existentialist. Correct. And essentially what he was trying to do was to say, we live in a world without any meaning. What is the only meaning we can impose? And he answers the only meaning we can impose is the meaning of
good people,
healing the world and being good people and taking action. But I agree with you, Yosefa, but I think it can be used as a very good basis on which to build in the third era, if we're using Greenberg's language or Greenberg's vision, the human response to the pandemic today.
Yeah, and I want to also circle us back to David Kessler.
Yeah.
His most recent book is Finding Meaning, and his book is really about grief and loss, and he who co-researched and co-wrote with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross decades ago, when she sort of made the 5 stages of death and also afterwards of grief, famous within the world. But the point is that in Kessler's research and in this book that he puts out, which is really excellent, he talks about the 6th stage of meaning, and he himself is quite familiar with loss and suffering in his own life, and he talks about the meaning stage. And the truth is that Tanya, I really wanted to, and I really recommend really anybody listening to this podcast to read that book. It's a very easy read. I think it's really helpful for anybody who's gone through specific loss in their life. And I think it's also really informative for people who are experiencing or witnessing other people's loss in their life, which is basically every human on the planet. And I think it's really helpful in helping people, giving them language, helping them learn how to speak and speak more sensitively to others.
Yosefa, I just wanted to say the only thing that I would add is that the 5 stages that you spoke about, I think depression and denial and anger and all of those things that come with it, it takes time. And I think we're still in the pandemic.
Yes.
And I think in a sense, what Kessler perhaps would say to us is, to get to that final stage that he speaks about of finding meaning. And by the way, he says it can come at any time, meaning sometimes it comes at the beginning and sometimes it comes at end. It's not
linear. It's not linear, but he does say you have to go through a number of the other. You can't be in fresh loss and find meaning. And he says if you found 100%. Meaning very soon after your loss, he said you will have to revisit that meaning later on because it's not coming at a psychologically healthy space.
100%. And by the way, that adds into the theological responses that came immediately after the pandemic, saying to us, it's for this reason and that reason. It needs time. It requires space. It needs that makom that we spoke about, that space in order to find that meaning. But that's exactly what I'm trying to say. I think that for all of us, we're still in it. It's still so raw, and perhaps meaning and personal meaning comes with time. So I just wanted to add that in because I think it's super important for us at this stage to recognize that. No,
I totally hear that. The truth is that, Tanya, as we start to wind down the episode, I kind of wanted to ask you if you have been able to make any meaning, theologic or otherwise, from the past 2 years. You can share as personal or not as you'd like, but I'm curious, and I'll also share afterward. What do you feel that you've been able to take out of this period?
It's a really tough question because I think at every stage there was something different that was kind of moving around my head. For 7 years prior to the pandemic, my mum was going through her cancer journey, and we were thrown into a lot of chaos and a lot of uncertainty. And I think in a sense, and during it, unfortunately, my father passed away very suddenly. And I think that in a sense that gave me the tools for coping and dealing with this sense of uncertainty, of contingency, that I really learnt things about myself that I definitely had not known before. I always it reminds me very much of Jordan Peterson, who American intellect writer. He speaks about the idea of order and chaos, and in a sense, the human tendency towards order and away from chaos. But the fact that to a degree, creativity and many good things comes from being in a stage or in a sense in an area or in a space of chaos, and that as humans we have to straddle that kind of dialectical tension between order and chaos. And I feel like for me personally, I had to keep reminding myself of that message, that creativity comes or can come from moments of chaos. I remember I actually wrote this article about Kohelet in the time of Corona, when there isn't a time to everything. And I spoke about this idea of how I was writing at the time of Corona. I had been through everything I've been through with my mom and various other things. And Ian's work, my husband's a surgeon, and he was going to the hospital, coming back and stripping down, not coming into the house. And there was a lot of fear, managing the fear of him bringing something home from the hospital, managing the fear of the kids, managing my fear, our fear. And I remember sitting there, thinking to myself, how am I going to write my doctorate? How am I going to be able to find that headspace that I had never been able to do without going to a library and closing myself off and being opposite the computer? And you know what? I did it. I absolutely managed, whilst trying to create plasticine frogs and help Zooms go on with the kids upstairs. And I managed between all of that still to find a sense of creativity. And I think for me, that was on a very personal level, Yosefa, I think that was like that greatest moment of embracing the non-perfection of reality. Like just saying, I'm not perfect. What I write is not going to be perfect. My parenting at the moment is not going to be perfect. Nothing is perfect about this reality, but you know what? It's like reminds me of that option B in Sheryl Sandberg's book, right? That reality is very often, in most occasions, option B. And the question is, can we grow out of that? Can we create something out of that option B reality? And you know what? I did, and we did, and we all grew. And I'm not going to say that there aren't scars, and I'm not going to say that we're not all still suffering in some way or another. But and I'm not going to say it was for the best, because I would much prefer that the pandemic did not happen.
Right, well, that's finding meaning. Finding meaning is saying, I don't wish that it happened, but what do I do with it now that it's here? Yeah,
exactly. I don't wish it happened. But the question is, what came out of it? And I have to say that I look at my kids and I look at myself and I say, we all grew in ways that, I don't think I would have expected happen. It was really funny, Yosefa, actually thinking about it. It's my daughter's bat mitzvah, and we went to do a photo shoot on Friday, and we planned it to be like, just before Shabbat. It was like at 3:00. Shabbat was in at 5:30, and we'd planned it. And we went to the beach. We were going to do it on the beach because my third, whose bat mitzvah is, she loves the beach and she loves the sea and she's into gymnastics. She loves moving around. So we went to the beach, and it was the worst photo situation ever. The wind was blowing, the light was terrible, it was awful. And the photographer, who was great, said, you know what, I'm going to take a few pictures of her doing gymnastics, but we have to move to a different location. And we did it. We all moved, and 4 daughters who are all, I need to look good, I want to look this, everyone just Zorem, even Ian and I, who can get super stressed about these situations. And it was like Shabbat was coming and everyone just did it. And we just moved location, and we all, and talking, this is such a mundane thing, but I'm just saying, I actually looked at my kids and I said, you know what? Corona's taught us, we don't need to stress the small things. It was totally fine. Yeah, the energy was not great at the beginning, but we all got into it and we all got back into it, and very few of them were complete. And we just did it. And it's just a small example, but I feel like all of my kids have learned to just be more chilled about things that don't work out the way that they want them to work out. Mm-hmm. And I just think, again, do I wish the pandemic happened for us to learn that? No. Do I think that's the reason the pandemic happened? No. But did we grow and learn something from it? Yes.
Interesting.
So I would say for all of us that's
I think I'm happy that I asked you first. I'm going to be the Debbie Downer of this part of the conversation.
Yeah, go ahead. Listen, both of us, people identify with all of us because we've all had positive and negative.
Of course. We'll bring. That's why I'm so happy we're 2 people bringing voices that fit together and also are slightly different. Oh, Corona. I think. Look, I'll say.
We also have kids at
right,
very
which is
different
I'm
stages.
I'm going to get there. So I'll tell you what happened is that not only does everyone experience the Corona period, which some people are still feel that it's their present. I don't feel that it's my present as much anymore. But everybody experienced it differently because it met everybody's life in a different place. So it is important for me to say that when I reflect on my personal feelings about, the pandemic, is that in a small way, it met us in a place that was helpful. But in most of the ways, it met us in a place that was so destructive because we had moved to the South and we knew we weren't staying, and we had an extremely, extremely hard time. And my husband was also traveling every day to Yerushalayim for that last year and a half. And I had to give birth, and I ended up giving birth in the beginning of the first lockdown. And I was so grateful. I'm largely not an anxious person. There are some scenarios that make me definitely get me, but we were never in fear so much from the actual virus. So I know that for many people that was a very strong fear of theirs. That wasn't where it hit us at all, and not because of some irresponsible perspective of our health, but simply it just wasn't. We were working in a very sort of rational place, and from the beginning, it didn't hit us in an anxious way. That's not how my husband and I react to these kinds of things, but we were aching, and I mean aching for routine, and before Corona hit, and aching to move and get to a place that was healthier for us in our living situation, and where we weren't going to feel so alone. And so Corona, not even the first few months, but the whole continuation of it last year, especially, was so unhelpful. Also, my husband also ended up losing his job in the first part of it. And then it took him a long time to find a new job when we moved afterward to Gush Etzion. And there was just so much uncertainty. That was, the pandemic was kiviyachol the cause of it, or it was a big part of it, but it sort of piggybacked on our sort of chaos that we had because of our life. We had moved, and we moved to a place that wasn't fitting for us. So on one hand, in the first few months, it was great to be in Yerucham because we had a big backyard and there aren't a lot of people around to begin with. So we weren't like scared that we were going to be exposed to people, meaning that whole, and Corona didn't even come to Yerucham until we had already moved out. Like there weren't even any people that really were sick in any big numbers. So in the beginning, Yerucham was actually a great place to be, but from a social, financial, professional perspective, last year was disastrous. And also, as you said, my kids are in a different stage of life. My eldest then was 8 and I had a new baby. There were 4 girls also. And it was just utter chaos. It was horrible for my parenting. It was that we were living in a small apartment, and we moved into an apartment that was smaller when we moved to Gush Etzion. And, I literally had nowhere to go throughout the day. And it was terrible. It was really, really horrible. Again, not from the health perspective, but from every other perspective. It made me also being able to find work and start a new normal life routine really impossible. Everything was just delayed by a year plus. Were the good things about it? My baby was home for 11 months before she went to any daycare. There were a few good things, but the emotional reality was, I would say, pretty excruciating. But what I will say is that I agree with you in the fact that the years that preceded Corona, also, for me, it was just a time of a lack of healthy space, a lack of any sort of normative boundaries. I didn't see my family for almost 2 years at a time, which again, also that I'll swing back to this point about how universal suffering, but everybody experiences it so differently. I think that people who are Olim felt that very acutely. My mother also hadn't been here for 7 months before Corona, and so it made that period of time just extremely, extremely long. She didn't see my children for 2 years. Nobody met the baby until she was 1.5 years old. I mean, there were some, really wacky things that happened as a result. And I guess if I'll be honest, I feel now that I've really started to recover from all of and one other thing I'll say, and this relates to the age of kids, is that I also felt that for a year plus, we did Kivud Avim, and we put all of the elderly at the front. But I felt that there was a 6-month period where we could have been much more considerate of young children and the parents who parent them. But that for an extra 6 months, that was not done. And those were 6 months that I think were extremely destructive for people in my age bracket, where people had already 2 vaccines, but there was still another lockdown, and there were still schools that were barely open. And again, everybody has their own opinions, health-wise, et cetera, but I think there were a lot of programs that could have already been done then that weren't put into practice. And I felt that while I'm not his biggest supporter in the world, that it wasn't happenstance that when somebody became prime minister in our country, who also has school-aged children, that he said there will be no schools being shut down again. And I just felt that it was hard that didn't happen 6 months earlier when it could have. So that was something also I just felt like as a parent, in my 30s with young children, it doesn't matter your age bracket, but a lot of us are in that age bracket, that I felt that we were kind of invisible for a long time. And we also weren't the people who had any time or mental or emotional space to go out and protest, because we were busy trying to keep our lives in some semblance of together. So I also at a certain point got angry. If you could talk about stages of grief, I definitely had anger in there.
Yeah.
So, but I will say that, Tanya, I'm not in a meeting place yet. I'm still recovering. I think also it's taking me a while for my parenting to recover. I had just a lot of negative feelings that I felt came out in the direction of my children. There was so much together time, which again, like in the first few months was cute, and then it became uncute. And so I feel that I'm sort of like rebuilding up my parenting stamina. And I think there were a lot of marriages also that went through very, very tough seasons during this time for all the obvious reasons. And so I feel that I'm recovering. I'm happy that the days when I wake up and I have had a week of routine, and it's like literally the most blessed thing. And I got a job, and that's amazing. But I definitely I'm not in a place yet where I'm even interested in finding meaning in the pandemic. For me, it was a massive nuisance in our life that caused a lot of damage that we're still recovering from. So I think that maybe over time I'll be able to find meaning in it. And certainly there are things that were learned. But for me, if I'm speaking just about me personally, not about, humanity as a whole, the jury's still out for me on the meaning piece.
So I think that's interesting. I think, as you said, the what question, what can we take from it, is something that happens at different stages for different people. But I want to just swing back to the theological dilemma, which is where we started the whole podcast. And I want to just ask, we've looked, when we're talking about the pandemic, we began with Yitz Greenberg, and we spoke about the idea of the three different eras that we're living in, that perhaps maybe this era is the era of modernity, the era of the lay people, where God is super hidden in a physical way, but maybe super close in a spiritual way. And that perhaps one of the things that we need to do is to take the greatest amount of responsibility. We looked at, Bernard-Henri Levi, who speaks about this idea of the arbitrariness of the plague. We spoke about radical theism that says, no, this plague is the reason for this plague is because we haven't done what we need to do, X, Y, Z, blame and shame. And then we spoke about Camus and the idea of, perhaps it's arbitrary, but that doesn't mean we can't impose some kind of meaning by taking responsible human action and healing those in the image of God, etc., etc. We spoke about David Kessler, and we spoke about both of our experiences where we've, you said, I'm not ready to impose any, not even to ask the what question, and I'm still in my anger a bit, I'm still in my grief, I'm still in what I've lost. And I said, I definitely feel like there's lessons that I've learned for myself, about my kids, about our family life, and perhaps about our resilience. And again, not saying anything universal, generic about the plague, but about the pandemic, but on a very personal level. But I really would like to bring in, I know we brought him in before, but I want to bring him in again. It was his Yortzeit last week, Rabbi Sachs. And he, for me, the one thing I found so profound about him is that he was a philosopher. He was a thinker. He spent his days, his life immersed in thought and philosophy and questions. And yet when it came to the problem of evil and the problem of suffering, there was no question for him. It was almost as if he just felt at peace with the question. And the one thing he kept saying was that he brought us back to that midrash that talks about Moshe asking to see God's face and Hashem refusing. And he says that perhaps one of the reasons that Hashem refused to show Moshe his face, meaning to show him the clarity and the meaning and the black and white answers of everything that happens in this world, is because the minute he would show him the answer, Moshe would not feel that imperative to fix the world, that imperative of tikkun olam. And that may be one of the things that we have to reflect on when we speak about the problem of evil, and when we speak about suffering and grief and pandemics and personal suffering and illness and all those various other things that we see day in, day out, that perennial human problem of why good people suffer and why there's grief and evil in the world, is that perhaps we have to say that the reason we don't have an answer and the reason we don't impose, one-dimensional answers perhaps, and blaming and shaming on these enormous questions, is because when we do, we kind of take away our responsibility to act. We no longer have a religious imperative to heal the suffering, because we say, like Job's friends, you must have done something to deserve this. And instead, says Rabbi Sachs, what we have to do is we have to say, I don't know why this has happened, and I don't understand God's ways, but I'm going to ask the question, I'm going to reflect on why this is happening, and I'm going to say that my job is to try somehow, in some small way, to ease the suffering, whether that be through helping the other, whether that be through simply sitting with the other in their grief, whether that be through research, R&D of medicine and cures, etc., when we're talking about the pandemic, whether that be through looking for various ways to ease, whatever it is, all these different responses, that's what allows us to answer not the why question that we always said, but the what question, as Rav Soloveitchik, we said last time, right? We can't ask the why, we have to ask the what.
I want to just close the conversation by circling back to the opening of this episode, and where we sort of presented universal suffering and individual suffering. Are they somewhat different? Are they really very similar? And I think that what we've come out with throughout this episode is that they're really not that different. That suffering is a universal experience that everybody goes through, and that we do have to recognize, though, that while we're all going through in this case with Corona, a related universal experience, everybody's experiencing it very differently. And I think that has to be applied also for death, right? And all different tragedies that happen, that we recognize that on one hand, it's supposed to be a comforting thought that these are things that people in the world experience, not everybody in the world, but people in the world experience them. On the other hand, both the witness and the person going through it recognizes or needs to recognize that everybody experiences it differently. Tanya, it's been an absolute pleasure having these conversations with you, as colleagues and at this point also friends, to think about these ideas, share sources that have helped give us language and helped us move through these questions while knowing from the outset that there really weren't going to be any clear answers. And my real prayer is that anyone who's listening to these episodes, that we've also helped you try and find language that feels right for you or doesn't feel right to you, and then that helps you also understand what is right for you, and open up different avenues of thinking and of feeling. I'll just say that if anyone wants to hear more from me, I teach at Matan on Thursday mornings at 9:00. This first semester, I'm teaching biblical poetry through the prism of Shir Shirim and Tehillim, and second semester, I'll be discussing destruction in the book of Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, and I'll be continuing here on the podcast, please God, as the year continues and progresses. Tanya, where can people hear more and read more of you?
So first I have a blog which I update at the moment infrequently, but hopefully will be more frequently. But there's a lot of resources there, a lot of past blogs. That's www.contemplatingtorah.wordpress.com. And I teach at Matan in various branches. They can all be found on the Matan website. You can type in Tanya White. I teach in Renana, hybrid also for those who are not near to Renana on a Tuesday mornings at 9 on Yosef narratives. I teach in Chashmonaim and I teach in Zichron Yaakov. I also do a study group on Thursdays at Matan Renana as well. So plenty of opportunities, and I'd love to see everyone, whoever wants to reach out.
Tanya, it's been a pleasure. I wanted to add a short piece as an epilogue to this series. There were two songs that came out in Israel by two of our leading singers in the general public of Israel. They both happen to be religious. One by Bernard-Henri and one by Yishay Ribo. And each of their songs that they wrote about Corona, that both came out very, very early on, I think really point to the dichotomy that we've been speaking about, or we've been sort of circling throughout these episodes.
כבר חשבנו ניצחנו הכל מגדלים בשמיים בנינו.
In the song that is put out by Bernard-Henri, I'm just going to read a short piece of it, and afterward you'll hear it played on the episode. He says the following. He says, Ech hichzalt et hashfiut, you've returned our sanity, gagwim levnei adam, we've now are able to long for other humans, pitom sorefet habdidut, kvar lo tasei mipo lesham, we are aching with loneliness, we're not traveling anymore, flying to different locations, there are weddings with almost no one there, Kimat ibadnu et atzmenu, kimat hifsaknu lahargish. And he was saying in the world before Corona, we almost lost ourselves, we almost stopped feeling it all. And he's speaking about the over-technologized world and the fact that everything has become digitalized and human contact has become minimalized. And then that became so extreme in the Corona, certainly the beginning of the Corona period, when nobody was able to be together at all. And he finishes at the end of this short but really beautiful song, Od ma'at ze hakol yigamer, soon it'll all be over, ve'ani mevakesh im efshar, and I am asking, please, shebaboker achrei shetelchi, that the morning after you go, lo nihiyeh shuv oto davar, sorry, I'm crying, that we won't be the same. And in this song of his, Bernard-Henri doesn't refer to God. He doesn't ask any why or big theological questions. He just reflects as a human. And he says that, before Corona, we had lost ourselves. We had lost a bit of our humanity. And Corona has been able to return some of that, or to reestablish that humanity for us. And I just hope, I pray that when you are gone, right now we know there's not really a before and after. There's not really a day where Corona won't be there. But in the period where you become less prominent, I hope that we won't revert to our old ways. I hope that we'll retain that appreciation and that love and that longing for humans that we've lost in this digitalized age.
עוד מעט זה הכל ייגמר ואני מבקש אם אפשר שבבוקר אחרי שתלכי לא נהיה שוב אותו הדבר.
The song that Yishai Ribo puts out, which they really came out very, very close to one another. He, in his chorus, asks directly the why question. And he says, what do you want us to understand from this? How do we become close and distance, assumingly from God, with this pain? I want to live with you and not to be alone. What do you want us to learn from this? And how will we know to reunite in all this division? Until we'll be able to recrown you with a divine crown. And there he's referring to the piyut, to the liturgical prayer that we say on Yom Kippur. And Yishai Ribo in his chorus goes directly at the why question. God, why have you done this? How can I maintain a close relationship with you when I feel that I've been thrust so far away? And these responses, again, none of which I'm presenting as correct or incorrect, when they came out, it really highlighted it for me, these two different human responses to difficulty. I don't think that Yishai Ribo was saying that we shouldn't learn from it. He says in the second part of his chorus, what are we supposed to learn from this? But he very clearly directs his questions to God and asks the why question. Whereas Bernard-Henri really pulls back from asking that kind of question. It simply doesn't seem to be what interests him.
ומה אתה רוצה שנלמד מזה ואיך נדע להתאחד בפירוד הזה שמע ישראל השם אחד ושמו אחד.
So I encourage you to look at those two songs. You can look it up on YouTube. They'll also be in the show notes as well. And I also want to say here, if anybody is still listening at this point in the recording, that after the fourth episode, after this episode airs, we are going to be having a Facebook Live question and response session. And so I encourage you to send us questions to our email that you'll hear rolling at the end of the credits for today. And we'll check them out there. Or you can send them if you have my email or Tanya's email or Matan's general email. You can please send us your questions and we'll be happy to address them in a short Facebook Live session that will appear a week after this airs.
בין אדר לבין ניסן נפל פור זה הגורל אומרים זה זמן שמסוגל לנצח המזל
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Thank you to the entire Matan team for their input. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website, and write us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.